Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you today and to thank you for taking the time to join us for this webinar, continuing the STC Sustainability Conference series, Growing in the Green. The focus today will be on living mulches and plant team mixtures more broadly. If I can take a moment to introduce myself, I am Jem Banfield-Zanin. I work at Stockbridge Technology Centre in Cawood, North Yorkshire, where I am a senior project manager in entomology and sustainability. One of our recent projects has been the STC Living Mulches project, which has received funding from the Rural Payments Agency and EIP-Agri to demonstrate and validate clover living mulches as a viable, achievable and profitable option for UK arable agriculture. This webinar is being supported through this particular project. A quick bit of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded. If you want to know more or have concerns, please do get in touch. There will be a bit of time after each presentation in which you can ask questions of the speakers. If you could please type these into the chat or the Q&A function, I'll get them read out and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can in the time available. There will, however, also be an open discussion session at the end, so any other burning questions you might have can be put forward there too, or can be put to the panel of speakers on the whole. As a quick run through the programme before we crack on, Dr. David George will be starting us off, setting the scene and providing some introductory context for the use of diversified cropping systems. Neil Fuller will follow up with more on growing with clover, and Emily Trivett of Leaf will wrap up the first session, describing Leaf's work with intercropping and putting it into the context of integrated farm management. We've got a tea break scheduled in next so that those who wish to can fetch themselves a biscuit or two and perhaps stretch their legs. I will then be kicking off the second session and will briefly tell you a bit about some of the clover work we've been doing at STC, which is wrapping up this year, before handing you over to Andrew Manfield for a commercial perspective on the use of clover living mulches. Dominic Amos from the Organic Research Centre will then wrap up, telling us a bit about how living mulches are being used in organic systems and on the experiences of an innovative farmers group he is involved with looking into these growing systems. We'll wrap up the event with the open discussion session I mentioned a moment ago. So, thank you again for joining us. I hope you will find the offerings today useful, and I will hand you over to David George.
Hello everybody, my name's Dave George. I'm delighted to be here today for this webinar to open proceedings really as part of the STC Sustainability Conference, looking at growing in the green, mixes and mulches. To try to set up the rest of the webinar by talking about why we should bother about diversified cropping systems in general. So as a few of you may know, I was previously based at Stockbridge until about 2 years ago when I left to join Newcastle University. So I've been involved in some of the work that we'll be talking about today, both during my time at STC and also now through my role at Newcastle as well. So the point that I'd like to start at, the jumping off place for me, if you like, is this slide here, where it's looking at, and you've probably heard a lot about the need to produce food for some 9 billion or so people in 2050. There was actually a review that was done in Nature a few years ago that sort of showed that doing that actually isn't too difficult. To a degree, we could do it now if we move food around better, for example, if we engage with a lot of the approaches that we potentially have available to us. That's not too difficult in itself. It's doing that at an acceptable cost to the planet, which is perhaps the trickier part. How do we feed that many people whilst at the same time making sure that we can carry on feeding people past 2050 and past potentially that figure of 9 billion. And really achieving that needs a combination of engaging with highly advanced agri-technology, but also low-tech farming practices as well. This is what we do at the moment, I guess, and this probably isn't the way to achieve that going forward. It's been an extremely successful production system, this large-scale monocultural production, but particularly if we're looking to minimise and to mitigate some of those environmental costs of food production for all of those extra mouths that we need to feed, doing it in this way isn't necessarily, as I'll hopefully show, isn't necessarily the best way to go about it. That's not to say that monocultural agricultural production hasn't been very successful. It has. It's done what we needed it to do, essentially. It's allowed us to increase yields year on year, really from about the, as you see on this graph here, from about the 1940s onwards, where we've needed to feed extra mouths, and really farming's been incentivized and encouraged to do just that, to produce more and to focus on yield over that time. You'll see at the end of this graph here, which shows towards the right-hand side of the image, which shows UK wheat yields up to about 2011. We're beginning to see with this monocultural production system a plateauing of yields in the last few years. And again, that's something that we now need to think about addressing, because we know we need to carry on feeding those extra consumers. But in essence, monoculture, I certainly don't want to be dismissive of it. I don't want to knock it. It's done what we wanted it to do, what we needed it to do previously. It's just that going forwards, we may have to rethink that system if we want to feed those extra mouths at that acceptable cost to the planet. And really, probably the biggest challenge of monoculture, it's one of the reasons why it's worked so well, but it's also one of the biggest challenges for it going forwards, is that it's a system that's very highly reliant on inputs. So here you'll see a graph in the top left-hand corner of your screen that shows that world population increase in the red, and also then shows phosphate production, the blue line there. But really that could be any kind of input. It could be fertilizer input, it could be herbicide inputs, it could be pesticide inputs. In order for us to be able to allow production to have kept track with the rising human population so far, we've developed this monocultural system that's reliant on using high levels of quite often synthetic inputs. And again, I'm not knocking that at all. That's done a very good job, as we've seen in the previous slide, of allowing us to increase those yields to feed ourselves. This, however, is the real challenge going forward to using that production approach. We've got a graph here that shows its bird indexes from 1970 up to about 2015. And what you'll see here, there's different types of birds, sort of grouped there: seabirds, water and wetland birds, woodland birds. But you'll see farmland birds there in the red line seem to have fared particularly poorly over that period from the 1970s up until quite recently. And the line that you will see, the dashed line, straight line that goes across at 100 there, is a line of no change. Now, anything below that line means that the impact on that group of birds is negative. Anything above that line means those birds have actually fared quite well over time. And I guess the main key message to take from this slide is that farmland birds, in fact, have been faring particularly poorly. And it's not just farmland birds. That's the example that I'm giving with this particular slide here. It's also things like pollinating insects, other insects, insect diversity in general, farm mammals that you might find on farmland, for example. So there seems to be a general relationship, and it's a relationship that we're beginning to understand a lot more now, with a lot more robust science that surrounds it, that supports that as we've increased agricultural intensification, we have had negative impacts, particularly on biodiversity that we associate with our farmlands. And some of that will be due to the fact that we are using these large amounts of land that might have otherwise been habitat for some of these creatures. And it's also potentially the knock-on effects of those high levels of inputs that we're using, particularly things like pesticides that may have non-target effects, but also, of course, fertilizers that might leach into the environment and cause issues with pollution. And really, those issues don't just stop impacts on biodiversity. We've also now got to think about greenhouse gas emissions, and this is the one that's really coming to the fore at the moment. Looking at what we need to do to mitigate. This is not prevent. This is just to mitigate the impacts of climate change, to allow us to keep ourselves below certain key levels so that we don't exceed certain thresholds. And of course, agriculture isn't the only contributor to things like greenhouse gas emissions, but there is a fair chunk there that comes from agriculture, not necessarily just from cropped areas, of course, also livestock playing a potentially significant role there. But you'll see in green at the top, something like the 24%. It depends a bit on how you look at these figures and whether you actually include things like transport and supply chains within some of these figures, but it's certainly not an insignificant chunk that the agriculture sector contributes towards greenhouse gas emissions. Why are these things now increasingly important? Well, I guess it's that they've been important for a while. It's certainly something that throughout my research career I've been looking at for 20 or so years. It's probably only in the last 5, maybe 10 years or so that have really seen momentum gathering around some of these challenges. And we do now have things like the Sustainable Development Goals in place that actually help us to start framing some of these challenges and addressing them at global as well as at national scales. So here you'll see all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, and if you were to have a look at those, you will see that quite a lot of them are translatable to agriculture, particularly in terms of some of the things that we've just spoken about, like climate action there, 13, life below water, when we're looking possibly at fertilizer runoff, for example, into watercourses, and of course life on land with the knock-on non-target effects of things like pesticides. But there are several other ones there that would also apply equally. Now that all sounds quite negative up to this point, and there is a real challenge there as we move forward with food production. But I think a point that I want to highlight, and hopefully something that we will hear repeatedly throughout the talks and discussions in today's webinar, is that yes, whilst there is a big challenge for food production there to realign itself with some of those sorts of things that we've just seen in the previous slide around Sustainable Development Goals, there's also, I think, a big opportunity in doing so. Because if we look at those goals again, we know that these are the things we need to try globally to strive to achieve. And whilst, yes, it may be the case that at present agriculture is contributing 24% or so to greenhouse gas emissions, there's also a real opportunity there looking at climate action for agriculture to capture carbon, for example, to allow us to store more carbon in hedgerows and soils, whatever it might be. A real opportunity there for agriculture with the land areas that it consumes to have a positive benefit on life on land, if we can look to change some of the ways that we do things at the moment, and perhaps even move away from that monocultural production model. Another really good reason to want to do that is, and particularly this is, I guess this is sort of UK, England focused, is that we know that we're going to be rewarded for doing these things in the future as a crop production sector. So as we've Brexited and we're moving away from the Common Agricultural Policy, and we're looking at how we will reward and support farming going forward. And again, this has been something that links back to those Sustainable Development Goals and sort of comes down through our Green Future 25-year plan to improve the environment and to really be the first generation that leaves the environment in a better state than we've found it. What that comes down to in the end on farm is that we'll have a new support policy that's sort of being phased in as we speak, really, with tests and trials that are ongoing at the moment, which will focus around the Environmental Land Management Scheme, ELMS. And this will really reward farmers for doing and providing public goods. So things like those Sustainable Development Goal, those 17 criteria, those 17 goals that were laid out there. So things like clean water, life on land, for example. Those are the sorts of public goods that farmers will be supported to provide with public money that will come through ELMS. And these, I guess, are the six key targets for ELMS: thriving plants and wildlife, clean and plentiful water, beauty, heritage and engagement, mitigation and adaptation to climate change, protection from and mitigation of hazards. So that could be protection from things like flooding, for example, but also mitigation of things like flooding as well. And clean air there too. And again, both a challenge with things like emissions from agriculture and emissions from livestock, but also an opportunity there to to help contribute towards these goals in the future and to benefit from them through incentives like ELMS. Now, one of the areas that I've worked in quite extensively in the past is how we can actually put things like flowering field margins into farming landscapes to achieve some of these goals. So certainly for things like thriving plants and wildlife, for example, and potentially also a few of the others as well, certainly beauty, heritage and engagement, could all be achieved by looking at things like multi-functioning flowering field margins around the edges of fields. And certainly that's the sort of thing that we have encouraged in the past through various stewardship approaches. And it's something that the NFU are looking at the moment. So it's not just those flowering field margins. There are also things we can do, particularly around enhanced hedgerows for carbon capture, for example. So a figure there at the bottom in terms of how much carbon could be captured by increasing the width of hedgerows or increasing the farmed the woodland areas on farms, or increasing soil carbon storage as well. And I certainly think as carbon markets start to develop, these sorts of things will become far more attractive, and hopefully there'll be a way to benefit from them, not only through ELMS, but also through those markets that might be set up. But I guess the point of today's webinar is to really look at what we can do within field areas. And it was certainly something I was always very conscious of when I was working with flowering field margins, is that yes, we can have positive impacts on biodiversity, for example, but we were only ever really working with very small areas of land around the edges of what could potentially be very large fields. And really to have a big impact on the farmed environment, where we really want to be operating is within the field itself. There's only so much we can do with the areas around 6-meter areas around a field, and we can have strong impacts by better utilizing those areas and allowing them to better deliver for things like pollination and pest control as well, if we use the right sorts of flowers. But if we can actually start to utilize some of those main cropped areas as well, I think we can, the jump in potential impact that we can have is significant. And that's where we can start to look at things like polycultural systems as opposed to monocultural systems, and start to consider whether we can actually try to introduce some of that diversity that we might see around the edge of a field with a flowering field margin into the cropped area itself. Now, that's not an easy thing to do necessarily. Like I said, we have incentivized and promoted and pushed, certainly in the UK and other places in Europe, agricultural systems over the last 50, 60 years or so to produce more yield, to feed a growing human population, and to provide us with food security. Because that's the direction that we have traveled in over that period of time, our agricultural system has really evolved with monoculture. So we have things like very large pieces of machinery like this combine here that work very well, work most efficiently in large monocultural fields. When we start to then talk about perhaps reintroducing diversity into a crop field and moving away from that monocultural production model, it starts to introduce challenges, machinery challenges, for example, that we don't quite know if we can necessarily overcome yet. But certainly something that I've been encouraged to see recently is the shift to things like minimum tillage systems, for example, the shift towards using things like cover crops, and really the huge surge in interest in soil health and protecting soils that's come really in both directions, from academia and from farmers themselves. And this is one of the few areas where I've seen the two meeting very nicely in the middle, to look at really what we can do to promote our soils, realizing that they're a hugely precious resource for future production. So there are pieces of machinery out there like this one, for example, that are beginning to be marketed to potentially deliver polycultural production systems. It's not just that piece of machinery either, and that could have been any number of drills. It's not just the Bednar one that I've shown in the previous slide. and in a piece of work in some ways linked to the work that you'll hear about later on around STC's Clover platform, was another project that I'm sure you might also hear about today called Diversify. Where as part of that project, the team at STC, along with other project partners, had a look at some of the solutions that were out there to those barriers around polycultural production, around intercropping and around plant teams, and actually came up with a surprising number of potential solutions at different levels of accessibility. A lot related around machinery, but some also looking at products and looking at precision agricultural technology approaches as well that can help us to actually shift and move away from monoculture where we might want to. And also as part of that project, there's an online tool that's been developed that can help to select the different plants that work best together in a plant team. And the example on this slide here is called the Three Sisters. It's where maize is grown with a legume and a squash. The legume provides nitrogen, the squash provides ground cover, so you have a sort of benefit there to fertilizing the main crop and to suppressing weeds as well. And this is really this isn't anything new at all. In fact, this is more or less as old as agriculture itself and goes back thousands of years, recognizing the benefits of bringing the right plants together within a polycultural system. And that's something that we're beginning to produce these sorts of tools to help us do in modern farming practices. What I haven't talked about too much so far is profit. And of course, profit is very important. We need to be able to profit from polyculture. And there are lots of potentially good reasons why we might want to diversify cropping systems based around the environment, based around capturing more carbon, based around providing some of those ecosystem services and addressing some of those sustainable development goals. But really, if those solutions aren't profitable for the end user, for the farmer on the ground, they're not going to be used, because in terms of that first step of sustainability is making sure that the business can be there year on year and is profitable. So we have to come up with ways and mechanisms and means to make these approaches profitable. Just a few slides that I want to give that I hope will show that this is achievable with plant teams. And this is the first one, and it's from a classic paper by Tillman et al. In 2001, that actually shows in a grassland system that as soon as you start to introduce more diversity, so species number along the bottom there, you actually start to increase above ground biomass. And there's a number of reasons for this. It's really, again, as in the previous slide, because plants can work together very, very well, and they can compete with each other at the same time, of course. But if you get the right plant selections, they can actually facilitate one another and sort of help to realize more in terms of overall production from that footprint of land if they're grown together than if they were grown alone. And I guess the key point to make here for agricultural systems is that we start to see those benefits with relatively small increases in species numbers. So you'll see a big jump there in terms of above ground biomass from having one plant in a field to having two plants in a field. And that fits our sort of potential polycultural model quite well. We don't need to have hugely diversified in-field systems to see these sorts of production benefits that we hope will deliver profit. We just really need to introduce one, maybe two more plant species into a standard crop field design. It also introduces a level of resilience and robustness against things like climate. So here, for example, if we have there's two different plant species, one that is reasonably tolerant to warmer conditions and one that isn't. If we have an average climate year, we might have one species are doing perhaps better than the other, or both of them doing relatively performing sort of averagely. Whereas if we have a warm year, it might be our green dots that perform very well and our blue dots don't. In a cold year, our blue dots might perform better than our green dots. If we've actually mixed those two together, then really in any climate scenario across those years, we'll potentially get a good yield that's sort of protected and buffered from those effects of climate. It's also true that as well as introducing a level of resilience, which will help with food security, certainly as we move into a more uncertain future around climate change, We can also look at diversity as providing ecosystem services like pest control, for example, which is one of the areas that I've worked in quite extensively, particularly looking at flowering field margins. But we can look to do that within fields as well. You don't necessarily have to encourage lots of parasitoids and hoverflies to have a positive impact on pest control. If you diversify a crop field and start introducing particularly non-host plants to it, you'll make it essentially harder for the pest to find the right crop plant to feed on or to reproduce on. And you'll make it easier for them to lose that plant as well. If they fall off a suitable host plant, they might fall onto a non-host plant next door. Whereas in a monoculture, it's just a sea of appropriate things to feed upon or to lay eggs on. And I won't dwell on this slide too much. It just shows that in the majority of cases, as you start to diversify away from those monocultural fields, you do start to see those benefits for pest pressure. And it can be as a result of improved pest natural enemy performance, but it can also be as a result of what we call the resource concentration as well, which I've just described. And it's not just pest control. There's lots of other ecosystem services as well. Soil formation, chemical bioremediation, pollination. And we've started to put figures to some of those over the last decade or so, which I think helps when talking about the value of ecosystem services to farming. Okay, I don't want to say any more than that because I think I've used my 25 minutes more or less there. Just to revisit the title there, why should we bother with diversified cropping systems? I hope what I've shown there over the last 20 minutes, 25 minutes is why wouldn't we? If we can make them work, if we can actually start to develop pieces of machinery that align with more diversified cropping models, I've hopefully demonstrated that there are a number of benefits that we can derive from shifting from monocultural production systems to more diversified scenarios where we might be looking at intercrops or living mulches or companion cropping. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dave, for an interesting presentation as always. Please don't forget to put your questions in either the chat or the Q&A function. But while I wait for you all to have a bit of a think about what you'd like to ask Dave, I think I'll start with the first question. Dave, what would you say are the key research questions that still need to be answered, especially on a farm scale, to make diversified systems usable in not just organic, but also more integrated or conventional approaches?
Yep, very good question, Jen. I think there are probably several areas that we still need to look into. I think some of those we've been looking at recently in some of the projects, the large projects that have been ongoing across Europe. I guess one of the main ones is how do we actually change our support systems to help farmers transition to plant team approaches in terms of looking at which crops work best together, in terms of looking at how you then manage a combination of crops in the field throughout the growing season. So I think that's where certainly projects like Diversified, the one that I've mentioned there, that have started to produce things like decision tools, I think have a very important and key role to play. I think those tools may be potentially used as much by agronomists as by farmers, but I think transitioning both, not just in terms of what we do on farm, but also looking at how we can make that information available to the farming support sector. So things like the sort of agronomy sector in the UK, I think will be a key one. I think a lot of the innovations that are happening with machinery will be important, but I think quite a few of those are that they're almost sort of happening anyway. Machinery developers are looking at new pieces of kit and what they can do with them, not necessarily developing them for plant team scenarios, but I think that is beginning to come.
What sort of, oh, hang on, we have a question. What cover crop would you recommend to underplant with pumpkins and squash?
Oh, I've never worked at all with pumpkins and squash, so a very good question. I don't know if anybody else, I don't know if Neil's done anything with pumpkins and sort of squash with cover cropping, or with something that you could plant underneath. Certainly with the work that we've done, we've focused more or less exclusively, so far at least, on clover, and we've looked at white clover, and really the reason, one of the reasons that we've done that is because it's quite compatible with the production systems that we've worked in. So with things like cereals and oilseed rape, for example. So we've deliberately used a very low growing variety that doesn't interfere much with things like combining anyway. I couldn't answer that for pumpkins and squash because I don't know enough about production in those crops to even guess at what might be a good compatible crop to be undersown on a bit of the crop.
I mean, I've not done any work in that area, but experience working with some organic growers. Yeah, exactly. White clover or yellow trefoil, sometimes they've used to undersow squashes.
Excellent. Thank you, Dominic. Right, now I know that Neil has an appointment after his presentation, so I'm afraid we're going to have to move quite quickly across to Neil if we want to have a bit of time for questions for him afterwards. So Neil, if I can hand over control to you.
You can indeed. You should have my slides up now.
Yeah, looks good.
Good. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Great pleasure to be here. I'm just going to expand a little bit on the theme that we've already touched upon with regard to food security, carbon, environment, and then lead you a little bit of a story into the bioculture idea, polyculture idea, getting clovers and other types of plants that can fix nitrogen sitting alongside cash crops that we're looking to grow. I'm going to start by looking at the carbon story and looking at the kind of challenge that we're facing. I know when it comes to media and headlines, aviation gets a lot of attention in terms of its carbon footprint. Agriculture, we've got all sorts of questions about in terms of its actual emissions and the role it can play in mitigating its emissions. And what I wanted to do was just put a little bit of context around some of the media stories that you may be listening to. So in terms of UK aviation, it does have a fair chunk in terms of carbon footprint, but so does agriculture. And when we look at how what we do at farm level translates to the food supply, we can see that actually there's a significant amount of carbon embodied in the food that we eat. And quite worryingly, there's a significant amount of carbon embodied in the food that we throw away. So while we're very much focused on sorting out the emission side of things and looking at carbon drawdown, carbon reduction, part of the overall concept is going to have to be a little bit of a reevaluation in terms of our behavior as consumers and our behavior as farmers. Now, from an aviation's point of view, billions is being spent on new airframes, new engines, synthetic fuels in order to meet this net zero agenda that we're all under. And what we can do is a very similar approach in agriculture. We can look at how we can improve efficiency. We can look at alternatives to inputs. We can look at alternatives to farming itself. But at the end of the day, we've got a little bit of residual carbon we got to deal with. Aviation and other industries are looking to buy carbon to offset their emissions. The neat thing in agriculture is that we can actually catch carbon. We can put carbon back in the ground. We can do all sorts of clever things to take atmospheric carbon and put it in the ground. And I want to expand that theme a little bit with the role of the polycultures that we're talking about today. Okay, a little bit more detail in terms of production emissions. If we looked at wheat, if we look at dairy cows, you can see big chunks of the greenhouse gas emissions, or the embodied carbon, coming from nitrogen fertilizer in terms of its manufacture and in terms of its application. And the idea with this polyculture, growing in the green with clovers, is to use plants as a source of conversion for atmospheric nitrogen, which most cash crops can't use, and convert that nitrogen into plant food that can support growth, yield, protein production, etc. The idea is then that we make the bits that are causing us a little bit of a problem in terms of emissions that much smaller. And the neat bit is that although we're working quite hard in terms of arable and we're looking at things like wheat with clover, and we'll explore that a little bit more detail in a moment. What we do find is, as we introduce more in terms of the biological nitrogen sources into grassland management, we find that as the forage rations get more complex, so not only do we reduce the nitrogen requirement for forage production, we see reductions in the methane production from both cow and manure. And the neat thing about that is then that it's significantly reducing the greenhouse gas impact of our livestock sector, as well as it could be helping our arable sector. A little bit more detail, look at the wheat side of things and benchmark its carbon footprint so we can actually focus on some of the nitty-gritty. As we see the carbon footprint develop, you can see big part of its issue relates to both the manufacture and, more importantly, the application of the nitrogen fertilizer. Now, wheat's not particular in its own right with regard to that. If we look at milling wheat compared to things like oilseed rape, winter barley, spring barley, they've all got the same sort of issue with regard to their nitrogen fertilizer impact on carbon footprint, carbon emissions. And we've been looking at how we can reduce with regard to the overall impact of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's great as long as reduction doesn't mean compromised yield. But we have been setting all sorts of targets with regard to dropping the carbon in everything that we grow. In the last 18 months, though, we've seen much more of a focus on net zero. So reductions policy, reductions ambitions, essentially now old school, old idea, old behavior. The real driver is net zero, and net zero as quickly as possible. So the challenge we've got with nitrogen, if we look at conventional farmers buying nitrogen fertilizer, if we look at one type of fertilizer, this is ammonium nitrate, it depends on where it's manufactured as to how much of an issue it actually generates from a manufacturing point of view. The difficulty is that we tend to choose our fertilizer on price, not on performance. If we looked at it with regard to performance, we can see significant changes in environmental impact. And we will very soon, 2024, be offered a zero carbon ammonium nitrate from Yara. And that will change the dynamic of conventional farming quite dramatically. But we still have, as you look at the graph develop, we still have residual carbon that no matter what technology we throw at it, just won't go away. So what we really need to do, target our ambitions. Yara as a company have probably single-handedly given UK farmers the 40% reduction they were looking for. But the zero carbon target is going to take a little bit more developing. And this is where this idea of plant teams comes in, because if we can put together a cereal or an oilseed or a potato with a nitrogen fixing companion plant, we can start to significantly reduce the infield side of nitrogen loss to environment and nitrogen associated with carbon loss to the atmosphere. So there's lots of good things that we can potentially do by teaming up a non-leguminous cereal with a leguminous companion plant. What are we actually talking about? Well, really what we're talking about is growing two different types of plants or a number of different types of plants together. And my experience started with crimson clovers and red clovers in malting barley with regard to the idea from an organic farming perspective of using the legume, the capability of the clover, to pull nitrogen out of the air, which plants can't use, and convert it into a form of food that allows the plant to grow just that little bit better. There are all sorts of benefits to this. It's already been alluded to with regard to improving soil structure, giving ground cover, suppressing weeds, providing a little bit of habitat for beneficial insects. But there's a little bit more of a story behind that in terms of agronomic benefits and looking at how the overall idea of growing two plants together can generate some different outcomes for farming. First one that we were looking at is how well we could reduce requirement for artificial nitrogen. We're also looking very carefully at the impact these companion crops have on carbon capture. They're really good at encouraging root mass, root exudate, and soil microbial activity with regard to fixing atmospheric carbon in the soil. So there's some really clever bits and pieces coming from that. In terms of barriers, why do people not do it if it's such a clever idea? It's often considered to be a tricky bit of kit to play with. It can be inconsistent in terms of performance. What we don't want to do is have the companion plant become an uncontrollable weed. If you're a conventional farmer, there are restrictions and limitations on the kind of tools you can use to play with the crop if you've got an understory. And people do think there is a level of direct competition for nutrients, water, and light. In actual fact, particularly in a dry time, the companion plant can help to conserve soil moisture, prevent levels of solar radiation from cooking soil microbes, suppress the weed side of things, and encourage drought tolerance and environmental stress resilience in the cash crop itself. So there are some good bits that come through from that. And we'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. Agronomically, if we try to fit this into conventional farming, which is where we sort of see the big acreage, the landscape scale of this, essentially it delivers a really low-cost system for very stable nitrogen production. There are potential yield benefits, and as I've said already, with regard to the drought tolerance, there can be some big steps in terms of boosting soils, boosting crop performance. From a carbon point of view, some really neat things that can come through. So we're looking at reducing the emissions related to fertilizer manufacture and other inputs. We're looking at reducing soil carbon loss. We're looking at reducing the amount of nitrate that is lost through the soil and the nitrous oxides that are emitted. And that's a big bit of the overall carbon footprint. And we're looking at developing quite significant gains in terms of soil microbial activity. The underlying aspects on that then in terms of performance within the cereals that we're finding, there's been great opportunity to reduce nitrogen. We've seen some reductions in infield nitrous oxide emissions, and we're seeing some superb increases in soil carbon gain and production emissions reductions. So there's some real benefits to the story, and I want to give you a few pictures with regard to how that works, why that works, so we can get a little bit more detail on the board. So overall then, in terms of what we're playing with, we're dealing with what's known as biological nitrogen fixation. And we've got a range of different organisms that are capable of doing this. Some of them live on their own, do their own thing, out in the broad soil, have a whale of a time, but may not make much of a contribution to overall soil nutrient platform or cropping dynamics. The closer these microbes get to living in association with a host plant, the better they actually perform. They've got more ability to use the carbon coming out of the plant to build their own activity, and they've got greater capability in terms of fixing the nitrogen that we're actually looking for them to harvest or manufacture on our behalf. The ones that we're probably most familiar with are the microbes that live in very close association with the groups of plants that we would know of as legumes. And these guys, not only the clovers that we see, but grain legumes and a wide range of other plants that we're beginning to grow in the UK, have an ability to do all sorts of nitrogen fixing. And it's not just small scale. If you're going to get into arable silviculture, there are some superb tree cultivars that are nitrogen fixers too, and can do a great deal for developing long-term soil nitrogen supply that can feed through the course of a rotation. I want a quick look at the chemistry just to show you where some of the pinch points lie. So this is what these little microbes are doing. They're taking atmospheric nitrogen, they're using a huge amount of energy, phosphorus-rich material, driving this whole process. It's incredibly slow, it's incredibly energy intense. At the end of the day, what they're looking to do is convert nitrogen gas, N2, which plants can't handle, into ammonium, NH4, which plants can build into protein, into leaf tissue, into root mass. as I say, it's a very, very slow process. And one of the things that we need to be aware of if we're going to use this commercially is we need to feed these microbes with the right types of nutrition. They are very much phosphorus hungry, magnesium dependent. And if we give the plants the right bits and pieces, if we give the microbes the right bits and pieces, this process works just that little bit better. Okay, so let's get a little bit more detail. What have we got? These are our roots of our clover. You can see the nodules where the bacteria are. And I just want to show you some of the bits that are actually going on below ground. So the plant's pulling in carbon dioxide, it's running its photosynthetic process. It's pumping a huge amount of this carbon below ground into these rhizobial nodules. The rhizobia are actually acting like an infection within the root mass, but they're doing a really useful job in terms of nitrogen fixation. The clover's also looking for some beneficial fungi and a little bit of bacteria that live outside the roots in order to help free up a little bit more nutrition. Our real drive, we're looking at nitrogen N2 converted into plant food nitrogen or microbial biomass nitrogen. The mycorrhiza really looking at freeing up phosphorus, and the bacteria that live in close association with the root mass play with phosphorus, but they also play with the micronutrients as well. So that little band of biology working in close association with the clover roots is doing a lot to pump the right nutrition into the nitrogen fixation process. If we put a cereal alongside that, we can see the cereal roots here, they don't have any nodules on, they've got lots of root hairs, and what we find is sitting within those root hairs, once the plant, again, like the clover, has gone through its photosynthetic process, those root hairs are enriched with exudate, and that exudate then stimulates the biology similar to the clovers, with the exception of the rhizobia, that are going to free up phosphorus and micronutrients. Now, the neat thing about it is we get this really nice interaction between the two plant types that doesn't occur when the plants are working on their own. So we find that the rhizobia and mycorrhiza work better when they've got the helper microbes from the cereal. And that actually encourages plants to grow. There are all sorts of very clever biochemicals that are manufactured in the root zone that encourage shoot and root development. We've got lots of carbon going into storage in the soil itself, in microaggregates. The microbes actually help to boost plant resilience to things like drought. And there's an element of protection from a wide range of diseases. So there's all sorts of beneficial things that are coming from that, not just in terms of building soil quality, building biomass, building carbon, but in terms of the nitrogen side, plant health side, we get some really interesting dynamics coming through. In terms of what we can choose, what we can use, we've really got two camps in terms of the clovers that we could play with, and it depends on the length with which you want them to be growing, the duration, if you like. We've got the cold soil clovers, red clover, white clover. They're the real mainstay for most of our systems, but if you want a short, quick fix, the warm soil clovers are far more capable of growing. They produce a lot more nitrogen in a much shorter time frame, and they also produce a higher level of nitrogen in their residue. So they stimulate more in terms of carbon fixation and stimulate more in terms of microbial activity in response to the residue coming into contact with the overall soil itself. But they're not the only things you can play with. We've got loads of different things we can play in terms of polyculture or plant team that we want to put together that could fit quite neatly with whatever it is you're looking to grow. So the question earlier about pumpkins and squash, yellow trefoil's growth habit is ideal as a companion for that. The berseem clover is a superb companion for oilseed rape. The white clovers fit very, very neatly with field scale veg. The red clovers can be a little bit dominant in a cereal situation unless you've got a really tall canopy like winter rye, for example. But you pick and mix the individual players for your team, just like you would if you were managing a Premier League football club or a national rugby squad. You're looking for the companions that will fit together. So you look at the architecture of the canopy of the crop you're trying to grow, and you look at the architecture and the capability and the duration of the nitrogen fixer, and you put the two together. How does it work? Well, what we tend to do is we blow clover seed into established cereals. What we find is, depending on what we're looking for, this is crimson clover with barley, with alongside a trial plot of a rye that's there. This is the same sort of idea, but this is using a red clover, because what we're looking to do here, the crimson clover is going to be short duration. It is going to grow alongside the spring barley, and then that's it. We want to take it away. The red clover we're looking for underneath the milling wheat, center picture there, we're looking to keep that year on year and direct drill our cereals into that. So we're looking at enhancing soil nitrogen supply, because the red clover won't reach its peak for probably 18 to 24 months. We're looking then to continuously grow cereals into that understory, whereas with the crimson clover on the left-hand side, we're just looking for a short fix. We're looking to get that crop up and running. We're looking to suppress weeds. We're looking to drive a little bit of nitrogen into crop production and then see that go its own way. We try it in maize. It's great fun in terms of maize. Produces a superb understory, and it does a lot to conserve moisture, suppress weeds, hold soils together after harvest, which can be massively important. Probably one of the biggest sources of soil erosion, soil degradation, late harvested maize in the UK, and an understory like this can significantly improve that kind of situation. But it's, as a technique, got application in all sorts of cropping. And the first time I came across it was in rice. Now, I appreciate we don't grow a lot of rice in the UK at the moment, but undersowing rice, bear in mind, is a staple for half the planet. Undersowing rice with white clover can reduce the carbon footprint of rice by almost half. So there's some serious gains around the world to be had from this as a concept. So here we got it in the cereal side of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about performance, a little bit about cost, a little bit about benefit. This is crimson clover. We're only looking at 3 kilos of crimson clover per hectare drilled into the established wheat crop. It's delivering about 40 to 50 kilos of nitrogen. So we're getting a yield uplift against an untreated control in an organic situation. We have the ability, it will tolerate the winters that we've got. We do have the ability to leave the crimson clover standing and drill into it again. So it's, one cost can be covered over a number of years. One of the things that it is doing for us, it's providing a food source for bees. It's not a lot of good for many other insects, but the bees certainly enjoy what's going on there. And the more permanent the clover is, we're finding the more we've got a diversity both below ground in terms of microbes and in the understory, where we're seeing more activity in terms of rove beetles, ground beetles, that kind of thing, which are helping us, I believe, with regard to, for example, predation of slugs' eggs. We're also seeing that because the clover residue is just that little bit higher in nitrogen, it's a little bit greater, more food source for the earthworms, and we're seeing a real increase in earthworm population dynamics. Same sort of idea in oilseed rape. This is oilseed rape undersown with berseem clover. We're using far less in terms of overall. We're looking at 2 kilos berseem clover. So the cost here, you're looking at about £5 a hectare. It's having quite a little interaction with a flea beetle. We're finding that we don't need to use insecticides to control the flea beetle where we've got good establishment of berseem clover. We don't need any control for the berseem clover. The canopy of the oilseed rape takes it out quite nicely, and it's delivering about 20 kilos of usable nitrogen for the oilseed rape plant. As the clover dies out, shaded effectively by the canopy of the oilseed rape, the root mass begins to degrade, and we find the oilseed rape roots actually really roar into the ground and explore the channels that the berseem clover leaves behind. So there's lots of really interesting things occurring with regard to the plant teams that we're playing with. It's been a bit of a quick overview, but essentially that's it from me. My time is up. So thank you very much for listening. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. If not, I'm going to hand back to Jen, and you should now be in control and we should be good to go.
Thank you very much, Neil. Fantastically interesting as always. We've had a question through. I have always undersown into spring cereal drilled crops. Have you any experience in undersowing winter drilled cereals?
Yes, short answer, long question. What you want to do is just watch the timing of that, but very definitely same technique. Two problems. One is winter cereals in terms of nitrogen requirement nearly double what the spring cereal will be looking for, so it's not as effective. The other thing is the canopy on the winter cereal may be just a little bit strong. So what you want to look at is increasing the row spacing for the cereals, maybe even dropping the seed rate a wee bit. So picking a variety that tillers well, and then looking at a relatively aggressive but low canopied clover. And that's where I would look, for example, at a crimson clover rather than a white clover. White clover is just a little bit too slow to develop to get competitive with the early growth stages of a winter cereal.
It would help if I forget to take myself off mute. Quick follow-up to that question is, for a bit of context, I am on 33 centimetre row widths.
Super. Crack on. Think about the timing of it all. If you're not delaying drilling because of blackgrass or for whatever reason, if you're getting the cereals established quite well and the soils are warm, so we're looking at 6 degrees Celsius, then you could get clovers into the ground end of October and they would establish quite nicely. The white clovers have the capability of going through the winter very well. Crimson clovers are a little bit sensitive, so it depends on whether or not you're experiencing deep frosts. But you could always establish the clovers and understory in the spring and get some benefit from that.
Does being on an organic system make a difference for this?
No, not at all.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that, Neil. I know you've got another appointment coming up in a short while, so I will let you get off to that.
Thank you.
Thanks again for your time.
Great pleasure. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
We will now move on to Emily Trivett at Leaf.
Hello, my name is Emily Trivett and I am the Technical Coordinator at Leaf. And I'm going to present to you today Leaf's work within intercropping and the role that plays within integrated farm management. Firstly, a little bit about Leaf and who we are. Leaf's mission is to inspire and enable more circular farming approaches to food systems through integrated, regenerative and vibrant nature-based solutions that deliver productivity and prosperity among farmers, enriches the environment and positively engages with young people and wider society. Set up 30 years ago, we engage with all actors along the food supply chain. At Leaf, we work within 3 core activities. First up, there's knowledge generation and exchange, and that's working with our network of Leaf demonstration farmers and Leaf innovation centres to promote and implement integrated farm management and to share the successes of that to the wider public. We also work on European projects under this area, as well as UK-based projects. The second key activity is education and engaging society, and this is through the work carried out by Leaf Education through initiatives such as Open Farm Sunday, Farmer Time and Countryside Classroom. The third key pillar is developing market opportunities through our globally recognised assurance scheme, Leaf Mark. Now, what is integrated farm management and the role that plays within intercropping? Well, integrated farm management is at the heart of what we do here at Leaf. It is a site-specific farm business approach that uses the best of modern technology and traditional methods. Attention to detail is key. Appropriate and efficient use of inputs, smarter approaches to business planning, and the adoption of innovations and new technologies all contribute to increasing productivity whilst protecting valuable resources. Today, we're going to explore how intercropping fits into an IFM approach by collaborating traditional methods with new approaches. IFM covers 9 areas in which we work towards best practice. These areas on the wheel include soil management fertility, crop health and protection, pollution control by byproduct management, animal husbandry, energy efficiency, water management, landscape and nature conservation, engaging society, and organisation and planning. Now I'm going to take you through a whistle-stop tour of each of these areas and talk about how intercropping plays a role specifically. First up, there's soil management fertility. Soil is the basis of all agricultural production, and the conservation and improvement of this valuable resource must be of the highest priority in the adoption of integrated farm management. This allows produce to be grown on healthy, biologically active soil with an optimum level of organic matter, a good physical structure and chemical balance, and sufficient fertility. Intercropping has shown to have beneficial effects, particularly as a regenerative approach, including reducing soil disturbance, maximising crop diversity, keeping the soil covered to reduce erosion, and maintaining living roots for a majority of the year, or in some cases all year round. A regenerative approach also contributing to improving the soil structure and increasing the biological health of the soil. As mentioned as part of IFM is to protect natural resources. Intercropping has shown within studies to have beneficial nutrient recycling effects, particularly when leguminous species are introduced into the rotation. Therefore, a reduction in artificial fertilisers is commonly seen when intercropping is part of a rotation. Next up on the wheel is crop health and protection. Integrated farm management uses and encourages continual improvement in pest control measures that have minimal impact on the environment, human health, and as well as human health, and which promote sustainability and profitability. A well-established and managed crop will be more competitive with weeds and more resilient to the attack from pests and diseases, and should in theory require fewer plant protection products. Crop health and protection is an area in which change of practice is becoming inevitable. So is intercropping one of the ways to help with this? Intercropping has the potential to reduce plant protection products. A success story seen at Leaf with a participatory farmer we worked with on a European project saw an intercrop of linseed and oats to the rotation. In the past, the linseed crops on the farm suffered from poor establishment due to the linseed stems being attacked by flax flea beetle before the seed had chance to emerge. The trial investigated whether intercropping with oats would improve establishment of the linseed crop. Linseed and oats were drilled together, and once the linseed was established, the oat companion was then sprayed off. Results showed that the pest pressure in the linseed was reduced when oats was introduced, compared to an equivalent linseed crop on its own. This negated the need for insecticidal spray. This represents a positive integrated pest management strategy incorporating a cultural method to decrease the reliance on pesticide usage for crop protection. As mentioned, intercropping, increasing diversity of rotations, and more diversity encourages biodiversity. With increased biodiversity increases beneficial insects, which can also help to reduce pests within the crop. Crop health also covers nutrient use. As mentioned in the previous slide, with the introduction of intercrops with legumes as part of that, can help to recycle nutrients into the soil, such as nitrogen, and reduce the need for synthetic fertilisers. Next up is animal husbandry. Integrated farm management requires that consideration is given to the way decisions are made on the whole farm. Not only does this include animal welfare, grassland, forage and crop management, but also attention to detail demanded to ensure sound animal husbandry techniques, environmental responsibility, and an economically viable farming business. You might think, well, how can intercropping play a part in animal husbandry and sustainability? Well, through research carried out at Leaf and within the projects we've worked on, mixed farming systems with livestock were found to be well suited to intercropping. For instance, whole crop spring barley and peas could be fed back into the farming system as a homegrown forage, as well as used to build fertility within the soil through the rotation with the introduction of leguminous nitrogen fixation. Similarly, where left to be matured until combinable, the product offered a high protein product as a concentrate feed. And this also saw an environmental benefit as there's less reliance on imported feeds such as soya. Both of these implementations were valued as acting as a whole farm approach to improve overall productivity, self-sufficiency, and complemented an IFM approach as well as a regenerative approach by integrating livestock into the whole farming system. Next up is energy efficiency. Energy is often a significant on-farm cost, so requires constant monitoring. Careful use of inputs, appropriate tillage, reduced reliance on fossil fuels, and striving for optimum instead of maximum yields will help improve energy efficiency and contribute towards maximum return in the long run. If efficient energy use is an obvious way to reduce both costs and carbon footprint on farm. The use of intercrops can help improve energy efficiency on farm. As mentioned in the previous slide, homegrown proteins can help reduce the overall carbon footprint on farm by reducing the need for imported feed. Broadening rotations through intercropping with legumes can help with nitrogen fixation, and therefore this reduces the need for synthetic fertilisers. Finally, as mentioned within the soil management fertility slide, reducing tillage operations is seen in many intercropping rotations, as the variety and diversity of rooting structures is helping to break down the structure. This mitigates the need for heavy tillage operations, which can have a beneficial knock-on effect to reducing carbon emissions on farm. Next up is water management. Water is an important resource which has a financial and environmental cost to farm businesses. Better and more effective water management is at the heart of LEAF's approach to integrated farm management. Managing water wisely, as well as assessing and enhancing efficiency of on-farm water use, saves money and helps plan for future needs. Intercropping can increase water use efficiency of crops by optimising the soil moisture environment for crop development through reduced surface runoff, through soil management practices such as reducing tillage, covering the soil surface with a variety of rooting structures to also help with the uptake of water. Next up is pollution control by byproduct management. Well organised pollution control and byproduct management will help to avoid pollution, save money, and plays an important part in protecting water, energy, biodiversity, and soil management. In many cases, farm wastes are a valuable resource if used appropriately. Within this presentation, I've already highlighted the benefits of the benefits in which intercropping can play with water, soil, and crop management. Improving these areas with methods such as intercropping can help to play a vital role in pollution control, reducing the risk of runoff, reducing the need for pesticides and synthetic fertilisers, all of which are key aspects of integrated farm management. Next up on the IFM wheel is community engagement. It is essential to communicate what you're doing and why to everybody who works on or around the farm, including the local community. Not only does this help them to better understand farming and the rural environment, but it also to help address their concerns and needs, expectations of the countryside and food production. Within LEAF, we have a network of LEAF demonstration farms and innovation centres, all of whom communicate and discuss and demonstrate integrated farm management amongst other farmers and the wider groups such as politicians, industry, students and the public. Intercropping as a practice is no different to any other on-farm activity. It is important to share the success and even the challenges faced by intercropping, not only with farming industry, but also to the wider public, to highlight an innovative practice that is not only contributing towards food production, but also towards improving our environment. Again, another key aspect of integrated farm management. Landscape and nature conservation. Landscape and wildlife are like any other product on the farm. What is achieved depends on the starting conditions, the capability of the land and the work put in, and it is fast becoming increasingly important in agriculture. And this is why it's a key focus of integrated farm management and what we do here at Leaf. Throughout this presentation, we've seen many crossovers with the benefits of intercropping across all areas of integrated farm management, and landscape and nature conservation is no different. By managing soil, crop health and water management through intercropping practices can help increase functional biodiversity on farm due to the reduction of pesticide usage, the diversity in the cropping and rotations, reduction in runoff, and even reducing tillage can help improve habitats. Habitats in the soil for earthworms, which can increase microbial respiration and biomass. Last but not least is organisation and planning. Good organisation and planning is key to integrated farm management. A starting point is that it's important to identify the short and long-term objectives of the farm business, reflecting on the key questions of where do I want my farm business to go. Within research carried out within Leaf and other projects, intercropping is part of the long-term objective of farm business, addressing the balance between risks of the implementation against the benefit of potential payoffs is no different. It is different for every farm, not one size fits all at the end of the day. Particularly when there needs to be more research to address and tackle some of the barriers faced by intercropping, such as end market uses, seed separation, harvesting and establishment issues. However, there has been research which has proven that intercropping has time-saving factors, from reducing tillage operations to lowering the need of pesticide and fertiliser inputs, reduces the time needed to be spent on the field on these practices, and saving time also saves within costs, as well as helping the environment. All the research done within our intercropping at Leaf has been done through the fantastic projects we collaborate with. I'd like to personally thank Diversified and Diver Impacts, which are two Horizon 2020 funded projects which we've been working on for the last 3 to 4 years. Diversified is just ended, and we've had a really good time on there, really exploring the barriers and enablers of intercropping and to take this further within other work we are on. There's also Diver Impacts, which is continuing, and this is more of a project looking at crop diversification as a whole and market end uses. And finally, there's Seams I would like to thank, which is an Esme Fairbairn Foundation project. And this is a project based in Scotland, exploring crop mixtures, as well as introducing the public and schools to explore what crop mixtures are and how they work, and engaging farmers. And we really are proud to be partners of all these projects and other projects we're part of. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me or drop me an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily. I think that was a fantastic run through the sorts of work you've been doing at Leaf. While we wait for any questions to pop up, I think I'll get us started again. I'm wondering, what sort of bottlenecks do you see to implementing intercropping and living mulches as part of integrated farm management?
Thanks, Jen. I mean, to answer that question, it's not just within an integrated farm management system, it's as a whole within Diversified. Particularly, we've been looking at the barriers and opportunities of plant teams, intercropping, crop diversification as a whole. And what we've really taken from that project is that there are still barriers there, such as seed separation. So if you're if you want to sell to a market in terms of food, in terms of human food consumption, seed needs to be separated currently, compared to if it's going into a livestock system, there's less pressure on separating seed. So there's an area there. And just to kind of like round that off as a whole, our next step at Leaf within project work and our own work is addressing what kind of like market opportunities are there for crop mixtures as a whole, if that's through livestock systems to food production, to even distilling. We're hoping to run a webinar later on this year with industry representatives to help open up opportunities there for farmers to see that the right end use is there.
Do we get a sneak preview on what you think some of these end uses might be?
Well, through SEAMS, we've been, obviously there's the whole homegrown proteins story, which farmers have been doing for quite a long time anyway, but as mentioned by other speakers prior to this presentation, is there going to be benefits rewarded to farmers if they're growing homegrown proteins and feeding back into the system? Surely that's better than buying in proteins abroad from, say, Brazil, in terms of soya-based products, which have got a higher carbon footprint. So there's that area. We're also interested to see if there is an area of looking at sustainable, like distilling. So obviously up in Scotland, a lot of barley grown for distilling and whiskey production. So is there an opportunity there within plant teams? And then we also work with Hodmedods down in the south, which help farmers growing crop mixtures and alternative crops. So there's possibilities there to open up opportunities. So yeah, there's just a few to name, but yeah, hoping to get more as we research a bit more into it.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I don't see any questions popped up, so I think that is an excellent point to take our tea break. We'll take a quick 15-minute break to fetch biscuits. I certainly need a snack, and stretch legs, and I will see you all again at 3:30. Thank you very much to our first session presenters. Thanks again and see you shortly.